Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. Today's episode will explore disaster resilience and its relevance to the environmental justice movement. I'm joined today by Dr. Cristina Muñoz de la Torre, Senior Researcher at Just Solutions. Cristina provides research, capacity building, and program evaluation support to our community partners. The expertise and focus of her work at Just Solutions is disaster resilience and equity. Welcome, Cristina, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. I know it's been a really busy week for you. Earlier this week, you defended your dissertation, so congratulations on passing.
Thank you.
This means that this show is your first public presentation as a PhD. Such a significant accomplishment. Can you share with us your dissertation topic?
Yeah, of course. So my dissertation is about the distribution of FEMA assistance across the United States from disaster declarations, and I analyze whether it's distributed equitably to low-income and communities of color. And I especially identify how social vulnerability and social capital helps explain which communities receive less or more.
Your topic is so relevant given what we're seeing now. I mean, you started the topic research quite a while ago. I mean, it's amazing to think about how significant things have changed in that period of time. I mean, was there anything in your dissertation that changed to be responsive to this current moment that we're in?
My dissertation is in the geography field. So in that sense, no, because the person that I am, I always came in with an equity lens. So the first paper in my dissertation is one of the 3 or 4 that are commonly cited with regards to equity questions around federal disaster assistance, because at the time there was really not much out there. Now, of course, it's really blown up and there is a lot of research and publications around equitable distribution of disaster assistance, but especially with regards to social vulnerability. I managed to still really push the envelope with regards to my research work, though, because not a lot of people are integrating social capital. And so one of the key findings of my dissertation is that not every kind of social capital is actually equitable and provides access to assistance. So for example, there's like different types of relationships, like relationships with close others, like bonding, and relationships with organizations such as bridging. And generally, it is believed that relationships with organizations would give you better access to formal resources, and bonding relationships are helpful for informal resources. So nothing to do with necessarily FEMA, but my dissertation shows that even though that's the case, generally speaking, for communities of color, those bonding relationships are so important that it actually does make a difference in terms of their support, social support, to help them navigate through such a highly bureaucratic process. I think there's still so much more to learn about how communities of color are unable to access FEMA assistance.
I'm excited to have a deeper conversation about that in the show. And I think what's so interesting about your research is that so much of the climate conversation about climate impacts often has nothing to do with humans. You know, it's about the impact on shorelines, on the geography of the planet, on natural resources, but not as much about the human impact. And so I think it's going to be an interesting conversation with you today. The other part is that you've often talked about that we should not use the phrase natural disasters. And that is generally how we think about things, is that these are just happening naturally. And you really help to raise that is probably not the best way for us to describe what's going on. Can you talk a little bit about why you think that phrase is not particularly useful as we talk about climate impacts?
Natural disaster implies that when there's large events such as Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, or even Texas Erie's response, that it is all based on like Mother Nature attacking humans, and that we can't predict or prevent losses because it's natural, it's Mother Nature, it's not us. But pretty much, as we know, that humans contribute to climate change, so do we contribute to disaster impacts. And that is because the way that when or how communities are vulnerable to disasters is, in a sense, pre-existing conditions that humans created to begin with. And I talk a lot about being able to hold those accountable, responsible. So cities that decided to build homes in floodplains and then not keep them maintained so that it becomes very dilapidated and only low-income communities can afford to live in those areas. Like that's directly putting low-income communities at risk of flooding. And we know that that happens. So that's just one example.
Your insights are so useful because of the academic training that you have created for yourself and the study and research that you've done around this topic, and really marrying the environmental impacts and the impacts on humans. And I think the other thing that is really important, and I wonder the influence it has on you, is just your lived knowledge. And to the extent that where you grew up and your experience with environmental justice shapes how you approach your research and your work, or even your decision to study the topic that you've done. Do you feel like your personal experience and your lived experience shapes your research?
I definitely came in, started my dissertation work and just my interest in and everything I do from my lived experience. So I was born and raised in South Central LA, in the area where we definitely see a lot more liquor stores than grocery stores. We're by the Slauson area. And I became more aware of the environmental justice issues we had as I saw this in high school, and then became more involved in like my early years in college around, traditional EJ advocacy around toxic facilities, doing advocacy in Camden, New Jersey, and Philadelphia, and back at home. But it was this idea of like, how can we elevate the problems and then start to identify solutions that made me interested in pursuing a dissertation or a doctorate degree. I was influenced and inspired by scholars such as Laura Pulido and Manuel Pastor, who make it seem so easy to do advocacy and research, to again like validate and to elevate the voices on the ground. And so I'm really proud of the advocacy work I did early on to highlight problems. And I'm also very excited to continue with my new skill sets of research to identify solutions for our communities.
Well, congratulations again for your accomplishment. And we're just so happy that you're here at Just Solutions and able to bring the work that you have completed and your lived experience into the conversation to support communities in developing their solutions to address climate change. Let's move into our talk today about disaster resilience and its role in the climate justice movement. Excited to have this conversation with you as climate-related disasters are growing in frequency and scale. And I think it's a topic on many people's minds. The cumulative impacts of environmental, economic, and social problems make the burdens and effects of climate disaster and recovery worse for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and people with lower incomes. So again, thanks, Cristina, for making the time to talk to us about this topic. So just to ground it in just a lot of terms that we use in this space, can you talk about disaster resilience and how is it different than how we've previously understood disasters?
So the way we've thought about disasters has traditionally been around emergency management and around controlling the environment. So we did a lot of emphasis on like building flood walls or like controlling rivers and just like, human control over the environment, which is very like colonial white settler kind of mindset. And because of that, the way we thought about recovery to that disasters is for more control. So that's why we would build flood walls. And also with that same mindset, we would think about recovery as like, how can we recover fast? Like go back to before disaster, like this feeling of back to normal, right? And this feeling of back to normal had actually real policy implications, because that meant that we would be evaluating success or successful recovery based on how fast communities were up and running again, which then had implications about who gets to decide how recovery looks. There's not a lot of time to have a conversation when you're trying to build back fast. There's not a lot of time to innovate, to question, should we be building back to normal or the original way that things were set up that pretty much laid the foundation for a disaster to happen in the first place. And so disaster resilience is different in that it kind of, even though some people still choose to describe resilience as, the speed of recovery, which I'm against, But at least a lot more people are picking up on this idea of innovating, of building back better, not necessarily building back faster. And I think it leaves room, it's not a direct tied to equity and justice, unfortunately, but I think it does leave breathing room to integrate equity and justice and to have that be part of the discussion around what recovery looks like and for whom, because in that process of recovering back faster, definitely low-income communities, communities of color were left behind. They were not being prioritized. Districts are often prioritized. Wealthier communities are often prioritized. Industrial zones are often prioritized. At the very least, this idea of disaster resilience has allowed for a venue for community engagement in general, which has been at least one platform for then advocates to come in and, raise their voice. Another agency that responds to disasters is the Housing and Urban Development Agency, so HUD. They have a grant, the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG DR, which stands for Disaster Recovery. And being that they're in HUD, they actually have a criteria to serve low-income areas, right? To prioritize low-income areas. And in CDBG DR, there's been many cases, including in Hurricane Sandy, where this criteria of making sure that the funds were in, at least a good portion of them were invested in low-income areas, that criteria was literally dismissed, or it was allowed for them to not meet that criteria so that funds can go out more fast, more effectively, or efficiently. Again, that really shows the impact of this idea of disaster as recovering back to normal faster. And currently, HUD CDBG DR, it's not an existing program. Like, the president has to approve it each time for each disaster. So it's not like current FEMA programs. And right now there's a policy that's going to institutionalize it more, like it's going to make it more permanent. And hopefully that'll give a lot more room for building in equitable policy and program guidelines around it, because right now it's very reactive and that reaction is not equitable either. But FEMA is definitely the leading agency with regards to disaster response.
Why is speed the most important criteria? I mean, what is the motivation of thinking about how quickly FEMA responds, which I understand we want quick response, but to sacrifice communities in the process? I mean, where do you think they're coming from when they make that their priority?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. At some level, it makes so much sense to respond immediately, right? It's a disaster. We have people without energy. We have people who are displaced, without a place to live. And so we do want to get some level of functioning to every single person as soon as possible. But I think the part where you start seeing inequities or sacrifice zones comes from who has the loudest voice with regards to their meeting their needs faster.
So what are some specific challenges faced by BIPOC and low-income communities when they're withstanding climate disasters?
Unfortunately, the day-to-day inequalities and environmental injustice faced by BIPOC and low-income communities are exacerbated during climate disasters. For example, before Hurricane Katrina, the lower Ninth Ward families already relied heavily on public transportation but were underserved. They had limited buses, bus lines, and undependable schedules. So when it came to evacuate, these limitations were worsened due to hurricane events as well as the increased demand on the transportation. And these communities, essentially Black low-income communities, were left behind without the capacity to evacuate. In addition to exacerbating pre-existing inequities, these climate disasters, at least our response to them, also widened inequities post-disaster. A research article showed that the wealth gap increased for communities that experienced a disaster declaration, which shows that low-income and communities of color remain worse off post-disasters even while others are recovering. One likely contributor is the unequal distribution of federal disaster assistance to low-income and communities of color, as my dissertation and the research of my colleagues have shown.
It's interesting that you talk about that, and I think this evoking of Hurricane Katrina is really helpful because I think it really brought to light exactly what you're talking about. And it's been a while. Hurricane Katrina was the day that my daughter was born, and I remember reading the newspaper and as the story unfolded, just really all of us recognizing the racialized dynamic around climate disasters, and it's just continued, right? And I don't think that we have done a particularly good job of thinking about the solutions to that situation. And so we're seeing it over and over again, but unfortunately having less and less of a public outcry and reaction to it. The coupling of race and racism and economics, and then how do you then begin to solve for that so that we don't have inequities around people's abilities to survive these disasters and recover from the disasters. And so when you think about the challenges to our progress, so Hurricane Katrina, as I said, I know very well because my daughter was born on that day and it was 18 years ago. And so when you think about that period of time, I mean, what has really been the challenge for us to address this problem? What are the barriers that we need to overcome?
This mentality of switching to disaster resilience is new. And some of those existing barriers are, again, like thinking more about the built infrastructure, thinking about houses without really looking inside who's living in those houses, right? We count about the disaster losses. Disaster loss was great because we count how many houses were destroyed or the value of those buildings, but we didn't take into account like who's affected. Is it low-income communities? Even if their value of the building is not very high, but what about their human lives? They still have value. But those ideas weren't incorporated in policy. FEMA doesn't respond to that, at least traditionally hasn't. So my perspective is that institutions such as FEMA, even policing institutions, were created to protect property. Whose property, right? It's particular property. You can see in FEMA's programs that, yes, there's limited resources, so I get that we can't give everyone money, right? But you can see the way that policies are made and the way programs are implemented, that it prioritizes higher value buildings, that it prioritizes quantifying that and building back the physical infrastructure without really looking at who owns it or who lives in it. But we know that when you do look at it, it's primarily higher, wealthier communities. And so this idea of like being able to provide assistance to help the struggling single mom, that not just to put a roof over her head again, but like to help her with rent or something like that. Like, you know, more like that holistic point of view is just starting to happen. Honestly, that's the barriers to equity. It's like if we don't see humanity, if we don't see pre-existing inequities, if we don't question race and income in the way that we recover from disasters, then we're just resetting up the inequity dominoes back up. We're resetting up the continuous struggling. And in reality, what's happening is that there's a paper that came out a few years ago that shows that after disasters, the wealth gap increases. So it's not just about setting it back to normal. We really are reproducing and exacerbating inequities.
Do you believe that FEMA, given how complex this topic really is, do you feel that FEMA is prepared or capable of addressing climate disasters the way that we need? Is there something that would call us to bring in more agencies? Is that already happening? And I think the other question that crosses my mind is that FEMA is within Homeland Security. And does that have an implication in terms of how FEMA operates and the work that they do?
Absolutely, it does. So FEMA as an agency didn't exist until like 1988 or something like that, really not that long ago. But it was officially under DHS in 2001 as a response to the attacks of 2001. And that's one of the second major structural changes to FEMA until more recently. I think Hurricane Sandy was another where it's a lot of structural changes that will kind of, Hurricane Katrina changed FEMA in that it recognized it as an independent agency. I'm not sure independent is the right term, but basically as an agency that has a little bit more of their own role, and made the administrator of FEMA the direct, like a consultant to the president with matters to disasters. So that happened as a response to Hurricane Katrina. So when you look at all these very few policy structural changes. It's very recent. But yes, the fact that FEMA is inside DHS is it's not great, to say the least. One example is the response to, I believe it was Hurricane Harvey, where they sent ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Department, to help people evacuate in Texas, where there's a lot of Latinos and immigrant communities there who don't trust ICE for really good reasons. And that doesn't help with the evacuation, doesn't help with a trauma-informed response. So I feel like that's definitely an area that needs to be kind of explored more in terms of advocacy and research as well. But you also asked me, do I think that it's set up to be able to address equity? And I think we have been seeing a lot more recent changes, both as a response to the new administrator in FEMA, as well as under Biden. FEMA has come up with an equity plan as well as other agencies. But beyond that, their strategic plan includes equity as one of their three main objectives. They have done a lot of different policies. So one example is the policy changes. One example is the Individual Assistance Program, which is the primary assistance that directly goes to individuals and households. They changed the policy so that you had to prove title of your house to be able to receive assistance for home repair. And there's only one way to prove it, but now there's multiple ways to prove it, because we know that there is people inherit homes, and in Puerto Rico, there's just so much informal ways of owning a house that weren't being recognized by FEMA. But there's still a discrepancy there, but we see that there's been efforts. A new policy called the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act is perhaps the most recent one that really uses the term equitable and uses, like I mentioned, social vulnerability and disaster resilience as factors to try to figure out which communities to support more. And it's new policy programs. Well, it's a new policy, and the program that it's using to execute this policy is called the Building Resilience in Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC. And that program's been for like 3 years or something. And it also hasn't necessarily the most equitable responses, but I think with this new policy, maybe we'll see more of that as well. So I think they're definitely laying the foundations and the pieces there.
Earlier, you talked about, how our current way of approaching addressing climate disasters isn't particularly equitable or effective. So from your perspective, what are ideal solutions?
There's a couple of ideas. One is traditionally FEMA response or disaster response is very hierarchical, right? So we have the state governor has to request the disaster declaration. It goes to the president, and the states get the funds in most types of programs, not all of them, but definitely some of the bigger ones. And then it gets redistributed and redistributed. And it pretty much has the same effect as a trickle-down approach, which is not effective. And it also definitely doesn't allow for communities to be on the table, on the decision-making table about priorities. So I think there's more effort within FEMA to do community engagement, although it's definitely lacking and it's far behind other agencies such as EPA. But there's an increased effort to do community engagement and to include that as part of the application process. For example, for BRIC, which is the Building Resilience Infrastructure and Communities program we talked about earlier. So we see a little bit more of those efforts in like mitigation efforts. But we still see that it's lacking in this disaster response because of that urgency still that we have. So in that sense, a solution would be to continue to ask counties, local governments to do mitigation planning and recovery planning, which they already ask for this. But in those plans, to strongly emphasize and evaluate the equitable engagement and meaningful involvement of communities. I recently sent a question to FEMA about the BRIC, because of the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act, going to be able to provide up to 75% of the federal match to communities. So FEMA is going to give more money to communities that are meeting this criteria to help with their mitigation plan. One of the criteria for applicants to submit is that their mitigation project has to be in line with the local government's plan. And I asked, like, how can applicants say, like, it's a community-based organization that has a mitigation plan idea. What if it's not equitable? Like, what if that plan doesn't involve them, doesn't include them? And so their response is basically like, work more with them. But I asked if there's an evaluating process, and it doesn't seem like there is a meaningful one yet. So yes, disasters, when they happen, there is an immediate needs, but they're predictable. We know climate change is happening. We know disasters are becoming more frequent, more severe. Things that seem impossible, like Texas icing over, are not impossible anymore. There is so much purpose behind mitigating and planning and involving communities beforehand and building those social support systems and building multiple ways of addressing a problem beforehand that is more engaging and that takes into account the needs of low-income and communities of color.
Well, and so much of the expertise coming from community will help us get it right. And as you're suggesting, people really know what they're currently experiencing. The communities that we work with have been experiencing climate impacts for a very long time, and they're experiencing them disproportionately. And I think what is interesting is your dissertation paper, which really daylights that FEMA isn't addressing equity in climate disasters. It isn't facilitating the work that we believe is really important. These particular changes are promising. When you look at the things that have been happening under President Biden's administration, the executive orders on environmental justice, is that contributing to the impact and the change? Or do you think it's the frequency of the disasters? Do you feel like just overall, just the organizing and engagement of communities and the advocacy that's happening in communities? What do you think is really driving more attention and more solutions to this problem?
I think what's providing more policy change around equity is definitely like the executive orders that have come out. But what's the solutions that are being implemented from those policy change are definitely informed by advocates on the ground who have been identifying these inequities since and before Hurricane Katrina and after. Obviously, I think like there's still so many more solutions that haven't been implemented that community members have been advocating for. And I hope to see these in the near future being implemented.
So if you are giving advice on this podcast to the community groups that are listening in, what would you suggest if they want to incorporate disaster resilience strategies into their advocacy?
I think community-based organizations, one of the biggest things I like to highlight, which I think they already know, but that is that there's such a huge player in the disaster resilience field, whether or not they're directly doing disaster work, because they tend to be always responding to community needs. And that includes when disaster strikes their communities. One advice is like, take ownership of that, right? Like community-based organizations are often the first responders aside from neighbors. Like there's neighbors and then there's community-based organizations. And they're often the ones who stay long after the media is gone, right? So recognizing that they play these roles, but then trying to, I think the biggest thing is like, I hope to see more policy changes and more program grants being made available to community-based organizations in recognition of that work and paying them for it. Because right now what happens is that community-based organizations are affected by disasters and they're still responding to communities' needs within their budget, within their existing programmatic budget. And so I think FEMA is trying to establish relationships there, which we think they should have directly with CBOs rather than this governmental hierarchical structure. Going back to advice is A, taking ownership of that, and then B, recognizing that a lot of the work that people do, whether that's food pantry, whether that's building renewable energy in communities, like all of this could be within a resilience framework, because that's what resilience is. It's like building the internal capacity of communities so that they can be better adapt to changes and stress. And in this case, we're talking about climate change and disasters.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of the historic work of FEMA is what you called trickle-down approach, and your dissertation is about FEMA's ineffectiveness in getting resources to low-income communities. Help us understand a little bit about how it was working that's problematic.
So one thing I wanted to clarify is that how disaster assistance is allocated is definitely includes not just FEMA, but the state, the governors and the counties. I think the programs that FEMA has makes it very easy for state governors to have a lot of decision making without having to explain or be held accountable to communities. And I think that's the result of the inequities we see, because city administrators are going to want to put a lot more money where it's profitable for them, right? Or where, there's going to be more economic vitality in the business district, in the ecotourism areas. I think that's what I mean about this hierarchical process, is there's so much decisions being made and prioritizations being made that by the time the funds are being seen by actual disaster survivors, hundreds of decisions were made without them.
It seems pretty fundamental that there's some discretion in terms of how funds are used, and subsequently maybe a political motivation around who gets those resources more than others. And with communities with lower incomes, BIPOC people being at the bottom of that list is, I think, indicative of what we're seeing broadly when we talk about environmental justice. So it makes sense that we would see this play out around FEMA and how they address resources for climate disasters. So the final question that we ask all of our guests is, what makes you hopeful about the environmental justice movement today?
Just coming out of my defense and realizing that when I started this research, there was not a lot to cite in terms of equity and disaster response, but now there is. I think that makes me hopeful. The fact that we're talking about equity in policy and research and in advocacy spaces more, not just in environmental justice, but in other areas that also impact our lives. We all live multiple issues in our lives, and disasters exacerbate existing EJ issues. So yeah, it makes me hopeful to know that we're talking about equity in other spaces as well.
We're so grateful that you work with us at Just Solutions and that you have been able to bring both your lived and academic experience to this work and our focus in really supporting community solutions. So thank you so much, Cristina, for being with us today on the podcast. Thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Batista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.